Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, folks, I wanted to do a quick audio check. If anybody on the call right now could please do a quick audio check, you can use your question function or the chat function, and please let me know if you are hearing me right now. Okay. All right, folks are hearing us now, Rob. All right. Again, I want to thank you for joining us for Factors to Consider when choosing the best LIMS for your organization. Today's speaker is Robert Walla, and we are going to go ahead and get the session kicked off. So real quick, before we get into the presentation material, I want to just take a moment and explain exactly who Astrix is, and obviously set the stage for why we believe we've got the right to talk to you about these topics today. First and foremost, Astrix is an informatics professional services and staffing company, two primary practices within the organization that are dedicated to servicing the scientific community. So a couple of quick statistics about the company. It was established in 1995 and is privately held. It had originated as an IT division of a company called APBI, which is the $300 million life science research organization. Today it operates from 7 offices throughout the United States, including international offices in Brazil and Costa Rica. And its headquarters is up in beautiful Red Bank, New Jersey. Around 750 employees total. So who we help? The target customers are Fortune 1000 life science enterprises, government, research institutions with large and fast-growing IT needs, as well as staffing and compliance needs. The mission of the company hasn't always been to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions for the scientific community. So real quick, in terms of the Astrix approach, you can kind of have a look at this after the fact, but it's a brief kind of description about a series of 5 steps that we take. It's basically a proven methodology designed to ensure our customers have the right laboratory informatics projects and that they align well with the business and technology groups within your company. And Astrix professionals lead business process transformation efforts in companies. We bring together technical, industry, as well as domain knowledge to tackle some pretty big, substantial scientific challenges within organizations. So this is kind of the foundational element of how we deliver projects, how we engage with organizations. And again, you can kind of read through this at your leisure. Joining us today, Robert Walla. So Robert is a principal at Astrix Technology Group. His overall responsibilities for growth and strategic direction of the professional service division. And he brings 20 years more experience in lab informatics, which includes very large global informatics projects. He has a BS in chemistry from Rutgers. And Robert, I'll let you kind of take it from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today for the next 40 minutes or so. What we're going to talk about today is the factors to consider when choosing the best LIMS for your organization. And our marketing department, puts these titles together months in advance, as you can imagine. They do a great job with our content on our website, blogs, white papers, etc. I received this from the group, I don't know, maybe going back a couple of months, and they said, hey, here's what we want to do. Can you put together some slides and kind of walk our audience through it? So I sat down and I read it. And it's like factors to consider when choosing the best LIMS for your organization. And I don't know, the first time I read it, something just didn't sit right. So I read it again and again. I said, you know what, I'm just not getting it here. Let me put it down for a day or so. And then I picked it back up and I read it again. And then it hit me. It really came down to the word best. It just wasn't, it didn't seem like it fit there for what we were trying to do. So I was real close to calling up the group and say, hey guys, we need to change the title of this. Best just doesn't seem to fit. And then it hit me and I decided to leave it. And here's why. When we get involved with clients, and as Kevin pointed out, we do a lot of different things in the informatics space. And one of the things, a big practice of ours is helping folks evaluate and select LIMS systems. And more often than not, I would say greater than 80% of the time, one of the first questions we get asked as we start to get engaged with a client is, what is the best LIMS? And it's just sort of matter-of-factly stated, hey, out there, what do you think the best one is? And, it's an easy question to ask, but it's a harder question to answer. And it's almost a trick question because really, if you look at that word again, and I was focused on the word best. So, you look it up and you get a variety of different definitions for, depending on how you're using it, of the most excellent to the highest degree, and my personal favorite, that is that which is of the most excellent. And really, when you look at it, it's really hard to even define it based on those terms. And now you're starting to look up the word excellent, which I'll spare you that. But really, what it hit me was it's very difficult to measure any of these definitions. So when we get that question from clients, we answer it a different way. So when we're asked, hey, Astrix, what is the best LIMS out there? The response is something like this. The best LIMS is the LIMS that meets your functional, quality, and financial goals of the organization. Or in other words, the best LIMS for you is the LIMS that does what you need it to do. It does it correctly and according to whatever regulations you're under. And it gets implemented according to a schedule that you laid out and according to your budget, right? Very simply put. So defining it another way, using a little math, best LIMS really is the most appropriate for your organization. Now, that may not be necessarily what the market considers the best. It may not be, if you Google LIMS market leader, you'll get a few that pops up. Maybe that's not one of them. And that happens sometimes when we talk with clients about, and give them list of some of the LIMS they should evaluate. They said, oh, well, we have a Gartner paper, and none of the LIMS that are on there are on the list. Why not? And sometimes we say, well, because you can't afford those LIMS, or those LIMS are meant for other types of organizations, or whatever it may be. So really, what it comes down to is not necessarily looking out there and saying, well, which is the best one, but what's the most appropriate for you? So going back to this, once I figured this out, I again was going to contact the marketing group and say, well, let's change this. But by then we had all the emails out to everybody, so I'm going to change it here. So in the context of this, let's cross out best. I'm going to initial and date this because I'm sure we have some quality folks on the phone, and I don't want them to get mad at me. And we will replace it with the word appropriate. So as we go through this, we're going to talk about what factors you should consider to select the most appropriate LIMS for you in the organization. So there are several. These are not all of them, obviously. I'm going to talk about three main ones today. Cultural factors. Basically, what's your organization like? What's the fabric of the organization that you need to consider before you go down this path? What is your organizational readiness? And there's several factors we'll discuss there. Financial factors, budget is always a big part of the evaluation, selection, and implementation of LIMS systems. And then we'll talk about some factors for the selection methodology, how you should evaluate what things you should take into consideration as you start your path down, looking out to the market and what LIMS may best meet your needs. So let's start with cultural factors. First and foremost, we talk to clients a lot, and this may sound a little bit odd to you, but we always say to clients, you understand where you are different, okay? And this may seem to you coming at it from an opposite direction, but a lot of times clients will tell us, we need a LIMS that can track samples. We need a LIMS that can store data. We need a LIMS that can generate reports. Well, almost by definition, LIMS can do that. There's various degrees of that, obviously, and you certainly want to look at those things. But, when you really take a look at LIMS and where you're going to spend a lot of your time evaluating it, understand where you're different. As an analogy, and I'm a big analogy person for those folks that know me, so I usually use cars, houses, or sports as analogies. But let's use a car analogy, right? So you're going to go buy a car. When people go and start to evaluate that, you kind of pick out areas that where are important to you, or maybe where you're different than the other people that are buying a car. So for example, you're a family, you have a spouse, you have 3 or 4 kids, you need to go buy a car. What would be important to you? What would make you different there? Well, maybe, a third row seating would be, very important to you in that matter. That wouldn't be important to other people buying cars. Or if you're like most families, you're, dropping off at school and soccer practice, gymnastics, baseball, pick your activity. So gas mileage could be very important to you. Maybe a hybrid's coming into play. So, you really, when you buy things like this in real life, cars, houses, you really look at where you're different. That's where we tell clients, that you may not, you don't necessarily need to start there, but where you're different. Because when you buy a car, you never say, well, my car needs to have a steering wheel. It's a given. So all those other factors I talked about, they're given in LIMS system as well. So, make sure you highlight some of those areas where you're different or where you think you're different, and, focus on that. The other stuff will fall into play. right? The tracking of the samples, the reporting, the things like that. That will all kind of come out in the wash. You need to look at those, of course, obviously, but where LIMS fail or where clients struggle with are in those different areas. Another thing that we talk to clients about is make sure you understand your risk factor. Okay, LIMS are risky. About half of them fail. So if you're a risk adverse company, a lot of times that comes out in the first meeting. We'll talk to a client, tell us a little bit about the company, who you are, what will you do, and they'll say, oh, we're risk adverse. We just want to make sure that we get something and it gets implemented, and we can move on with it. Well, understand that. So if you're looking at a system that's maybe a Rev 1, just came out, hasn't been used a lot in the industry, but it has a lot of bells and whistles that you find neat, you may want to take a second look at that or reconsider those. However, conversely, if you're an organization where you like to dive into leading edge technologies and maybe work with the vendor to work out the kinks and be able to put input into a product, then maybe that product is for you. But you really need to know where you stand on the risk scale before you go down that path. Another thing, and I think a lot of folks do this, is what is the appetite for change? When you're implementing and selecting and implementing a LIMS, things are going to change, and it's going to change regardless if you are on a paper-based type system right now, or if you have a LIMS, maybe an older one that was implemented 10, 15, 20 plus years ago. Things are going to change, and I get it. Folks don't like change, organizations don't like change. There's risk in change, but you really have to understand, well, what's the appetite for the organization? Because if it's not there, then going down that path of evaluating, selecting, spending the time and implementing, you're going to run into problems along the way. And lastly, and this is something that we bring up a lot to clients, is tell us about what you've been doing, and is there any implementation fatigue in the organization? Now, you may look at this and go, what in the world is he talking about by implementation fatigue? And I mean this. A lot of times we'll get started with a client on a LIMS project, and they're just coming off another implementation. Maybe it was a CRM. A lot of times it's maybe a LIMS system or something, another type of a technology that's used in the laboratory, and they'll say, yeah, we just finished this implementation. We did it. It took about a year. We finished it last month, and now we want to go dive into the LIMS system, which is fine. But we ask them, is the team ready? These implementations, they're like a marathon, and if anybody has been through them, you know what I'm talking about. After you run a marathon, you need to give your body a little time to rest, right? Rest up the legs, rest up the rest of your body before you dive into another marathon. So, we'll talk to clients about that. Is everybody ready to do this again? There's a lot of challenges when you implement, both physical and mental, and the organization needs to be ready to dive back into an implementation. So we have a lot of discussions about that. And if it's something like, hey, we just came off of one in a month, we may say, what, don't rush into it. Take another month. Everybody, kind of get back, recharge the batteries, and then we can we hit it hard with you. So, once you understand that, you get the fabric of the organization. We always talk to clients about, their organizational readiness, and there's a lot of these factors. I'm going to touch on some of the major ones here. So, number one is implementation order. Have you really thought through how you want to implement the LIMS system? Because there's a lot of different ways to do it. And here's just a couple. You can do it by functional area, where maybe you have a sample preparation laboratory or a sample accessioning receipt area that really needs some help because it's paper-based. And you're thinking, well, maybe that's the first area that we want to do it. Or if you're at multiple sites, maybe you implement it, across the, one site at a time, or you do it multiple sites. There's a lot of different ways to do that. But you need to really give this some thought before you go down the path. May affect which LIMS you select potentially. But the other is that once you engage a vendor, they're not going to know your organization. They're not going to know necessarily a lot about your problems and your pains. So they're going to look to you for some guidance on, where you think you may want to, how you may want to implement this. So you should have that. It should be socialized within the organization, and you have a plan. That's to say, it doesn't have to be totally built out. We do help clients out a lot with the implementation order, where they say, oh, we want to go down it and do it this way, and we say, well, may not be the best way to do it because of these reasons, and work with them on that. But obviously, before you start, you should have some idea in your head about how you may want to go about doing the implementation. Another readiness factor, which we always talk to client about, is master data. Master data, I'm sure, is probably most, if not all of you know, is the static data within a LIMS system. So what are your methods, names, equipment names, things of that nature, standards. You have to be able to start a LIMS project when you've got your arms around most of your master data, both from a standardization, especially if you have multiple facilities, and and certainly if you're in a global type of an environment, and from a harmonization standpoint as well, because this is something that you're going to need to do pretty early in your implementation process in order to build out the LIMS and start testing LIMS, et cetera. So that is something that you really need to be ready with and have the resources, we'll talk about in a second, in order to focus on that. Process standardization is another one. What you really don't want to do is start implementing a LIMS if you have different processes for very similar types of analysis. For example, we were working with a client not too long ago, and they had 5 different ways they were doing pH. I didn't think there were 5 different ways to do pH, and I've got a chemistry degree, and I'm sure maybe some of you don't realize there were 5 different ways to do a pH, but there is. And there's a lot of different ways to do methods. Now, you could certainly leave that out there and have maybe every laboratory or every site do the same method differently, but now you have to build that into the LIMS. If you're in a regulated environment, you may have to validate that. You have to maintain that. So a lot of guidance we give clients is, if you have that, standardize that as much as possible. So you have one way of doing a method. It will make your life easier, not only through the implementation, but as you maintain the system going forward. And then another one, obviously, is resource readiness. Do you have the resources in order to go through an evaluation, selection, and implementation process? It's going to require resources on your end. A lot of times we'll get in, again, conversations with clients. We ask them about this, and they say, well, we're just going to have the vendor do it. We'll pay the vendor. That's fine. We've got the money. We've got the budget. We'll write them a big check and let them have at it. That's fine. There are many LIMS vendors out there. They're very good at doing the implementation, and they'll do other parts of the project for you. But you still need folks on your side. We'll need people to meet with the vendor, right? To tell the vendor, hey, we want to do it this way, we want to do it that way. If you engage a company like Astrix, you need people to meet with us. You probably want to have a project manager on your side. You're going to have people that test the system, that do user acceptance testing. Vendor can't do that. Astrix can't do that. So there are resources on your side, and we help a lot of clients understand what resources are needed, where they're needed, and what the allocation is depending on what part of the project you're in. Sometimes it's front loaded on your end because you're defining requirements, but then as a vendor gets in there and starts doing what they do, the allocation of the resources dip a little bit, but then as things get ready and testing starts to happen, then the resources have to come back on board. So make sure you have the resources. They have to have the right allocation. They can't be doing their job 100% of the time, and then you expect them to dedicate, let's say, 50% of the time to the project, and they have to be the right sources with the right skill set. That's extremely important. The other one, probably just as important, one of my favorite factors, is the financial factors. And there's several components to this. So for example, we always tell clients, what is your budget, as you start down this path? And believe it or not, and maybe it's not a surprise to you, a lot of clients don't have an initial budget in their head. Say, well, we'd like to get down the path and maybe get a few candidates, then understand it, and then go ask for the money. Well, you could do that, certainly, but sometimes you'll wind up spending a lot of time and a lot of effort evaluating something that you just don't have the budget for. Again, it's like shopping for a car. All right. You have an initial number in your head when you do that. If you didn't, and you said, well, I'm just going to go out and look at things that I like, and you're like, wow, this Mercedes S-Class is nice, this Lamborghini is nice, this Bentley is nice, all nice cars. But, for most of us, it's out of a budget that we would have for a car. LIMS is the same thing. You could spend a lot of time evaluating, seeing demos, working with an Astrix, talking to vendors, and at the end of the day saying, wow, we like these 3. Then you get the quotes and you can't afford it. So it's a better approach to have that conversation with the folks that write the checks in your organization, kind of see where you are, And then from there, you can dial in your evaluation selection, into that area and not waste a lot of time looking at things that you don't have the budget for. The other thing with budget is to make sure that you understand that it's more than just the licenses. And a lot of times this is not really understood. There's a lot of other costs other than just buying the licenses. And we see this a lot when we're brought in after an initial implementation is done and it's not just one vendor or one LIMS. It's really kind of across all of them. We'll be brought in, talk to the client. They'll say, it's just not doing what we need it to do. And we start to look at it, and it becomes pretty clear that the LIMS had been configured maybe to 20%, 25% of what it's capable of. And then as you start to talk to the client more, they're like, yeah, well, we bought it. The licenses were expensive, and we only had X amount of dollars to do the services. So, we did what we could. Well, it's not surprising that it doesn't do exactly what you need. Another thing that we see is that a LIMS gets implemented and no training is done. Why? They don't have the money for it. Because everything was used to pay the licenses and maybe do a little bit more of the services. So you have the system that you spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money on, and nobody is trained on it. That has happened. So, recognize that it's licenses, it's services, it's training, it's validation if you're in a validation environment. That can be just as much as the services to implement, and a lot of times more, and it's ongoing maintenance. That all should be considered when you're setting out a budget for the LIMS. Also, plan for annual investments. There are times where, again, having discussions, it's like, well, here's what management gave us, and this is all we have. So we have to make sure that everything that we need to do gets done in this implementation, because we're not going to have any more budget for this. And, it's kind of a misguided approach, somewhat naive to a certain extent, switching from cars, to a house. I don't think anybody would go and buy a property, whether it's a primary property or investment property, without realizing, well, you're going to have to put money into that eventually, right? So you buy a house, whether it's a new house or old house, eventually stuff breaks, roofs leak, plumbing it doesn't do exactly what it's supposed to do, etc. I think everybody realizes that if you make a big investment in a personal item like a house, you're going to have to put money into it. You have to put money into a car. Same thing with a LIMS system. You will have to upgrade that. Things will change. You will take on new processes. You will take on new manufacturing lines if that's your business, or you will buy a company and have to extend that. So there's always additional monies that will be needed. And that can be planned out. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same amount of money for the initial budget. That's a big number, certainly. But, there certainly will be, some money that will be needed, yearly. And you can do it in stages, obviously. So if you didn't integrate all your instruments in your initial, put a little bit of money aside, and then take the next set of instruments. But maybe that's still not all of it. So you get to year 3 and you finish the job. Very, very common. We see it all the time, and allows you to, certainly plan out your LIMS journey according to your financial factors. Another thing we talk to clients about is don't forget the soft costs. When you're talking budget and you're talking money that's been allocated, it's always about the money that is leaving the company, the checks that have to be written. And that's a big part of it, don't get me wrong. But, we'll talk to clients about, well, who's going to do this part? You don't have any money for, let's pick something, validation, right? And they'll say, oh no, we have a group here, we have some folks, they'll do the validation. Okay, what are they doing now? Well, they work in the lab, or they've got these other jobs. Well, there's a cost obviously for internal resources to do that. And if it's a really big item like a validation, well, then maybe you're going to have to backfill those folks, and those soft costs become hard costs, because you may have to hire additional people. Maybe you'll have to go to some sort of staffing agency for some contingent staffing during the LIMS project. So, understand those soft costs and see where they could turn into hard costs, because they certainly could. And then lastly, we talked to clients about, the right way to go down and do a selection of a LIMS system. So here are some of the selection factors that, certainly you should consider and evaluate during your journey. One thing that we always talk to clients about, whether they engage us or not, is to have a plan. when you do your selection. Don't base it on necessarily a demo you saw, or talking to a friend that kind of does what you guys do and they like a LIMS, because a lot of times that doesn't work out. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about being most appropriate, right? If I could take a poll of all the LIMS users out there for all of the different LIMS systems, I know for a fact that maybe it would be 50-50 of people that like that particular LIMS or don't like that LIMS. We talk to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of clients over the years, and you can pick any LIMS out there, go to a person and say, how do you like it? And they're like, oh, I like it. It's great. Works really well for us, doing well. Then you go to another organization and you ask them, how do you like it? Same LIMS, same vendor. And they're like, I don't even know why we selected this. It's just not working for us. Well, it's the same system, and it's talking to people that do similar things. And, one likes it, it's going great. Other folks don't like it, it's not going well. Why is that? It comes back to being the most appropriate and those factors that I had mentioned before. So how do you get out of that? How do you get around that? Is, don't base it on, very, subjective types of things like a referral, like a friend of yours says, hey, this is great, I like it a lot. Base it really on your requirements, your processes, what your needs are, and you're guaranteed then to get the most appropriate LIMS for you. And here are some of the factors. We suggest, business process mapping, looking at how you're doing it now, how you need to do it, going through requirements analysis, developing some sort of request for proposal and going through a scoring process, and then eventually product demonstrations. Let me touch on these briefly. So, business process mapping. This is an example of an as-is state that we did for a client. Pretty busy, right? Probably, if you haven't done this in the past and you pick an area of your organization, you're going to see something very, very similar. Because most processes, unless you've done this, they've just sort of evolved over time. We'll do something like this. We'll get this roadmap here, and we'll say, well, how'd you come to this? And they're like, I don't know. I've been here 5 years and we've been doing it there. And then you talk to somebody that's been in the organization 10 years and, man, we've always done it the same way the last 10 years. These processes typically just evolve. And, they evolve from doing things very manually to doing things, as you start to put technology in and different technologies, and it gets pretty complicated. And what you don't want to do is implement a technology on an inefficient processes. So, we suggest to clients that they go through this process. Let's evaluate where there are pinch points and wait states and speed bumps, as we call them. Smooth those out so that when you do implement a system that you spend a lot of time and a lot of money evaluating, selecting, it's on a process now that makes sense. It's not on old processes that were developed somehow over time. Once you do that and you go through that process, you're going to see that you can really make things more efficient. What you're seeing here is the to-be flow to that as-is that I just showed you. And, there were a lot of inefficiency there in this particular case. And, the thing, one thing I want to point out, this exercise is not necessarily to do business process reengineering. That's a whole different subject, right? But this is to understand how data flows, how the process flows in relation to the LIMS system. Okay, so there are various levels that you can do this at. We guide clients on the most appropriate level of detail to get there, but you want to do some sort of understanding of how the process flows to make sure that is the most efficient as possible. Second thing that's extremely important is documenting your requirements. And the thing with requirements, using a house analogy, it's like your foundation, right? Because everything is built on the requirements. You'll document those. The vendor will use them to do the implementation. As you're going through your testing, you'll always go back to your requirements. If you need to validate the system, if you're in a GXP type of environment, you must have requirements to complete your validation. So it's a very, very, very important process. And here are some ways that clients go through, we go through as well to gather requirements. Stakeholder interviews, observations, it's an iterative process. Typically meet with the different functional areas, several times through this. when we're helping clients with this process, we have a requirements database that we've gathered over the years that we sort and query by various keywords that we can come with a template when we start our requirements processes. So we're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. And at the end of the day, if you're doing a LIMS project, you should have requirements document that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of requirements. Many times we'll get involved kind of as a client's going down the path, and they'll say, we started our requirements, can you help us with this, or at least, take a look at these and give us your opinion. And it's a page or a page and a half of requirements, and the requirements always must be able to track samples, must be able to store data, must be able to generate reports, must have a steering wheel, right? Those are the requirements that we always see, extremely high level. Right, but the trick here is you want to get them decomposed to the right level of granularity, and what you're seeing on the screen here, it illustrates that because it's something that's going to be needed through the entire process. Sometimes we'll talk to clients and they'll say, hey, listen, we'd love to hire you guys. Seems like you really know what you're doing to help us through the entire process, but we just don't have the budget to do that. So if we had to hire Astrix in one area, where's the best one? Where do we get the most bang for the buck? And when I get asked that question, I always say requirements, because again, it's your foundation. Let us get the foundation set, and then you can go ahead and build on top of that. But there's a very important factor when you're evaluating a LIMS system. So once you have your flows and once you have your requirements, now you can think of it as that, you've got sort of the what down, the what factor. You know what you need a system to do. Okay. Now it's all about the who. Who, which vendor, what product can best meet your needs. So there's really kind of a two-step process here. We suggest developing either an RFP or an RFI. There's different ways you can phrase this. Sometimes your procurement or purchasing group will get involved at this stage, right? And we'll help you out here. But put a document together that you can send out to either pre-qualified vendor list, okay, or if you have to go to an open solicitation. And we work with a lot of clients that are in the government space, municipal government, state government, Fed government, and their procurement rules are different than a private company. So they may have to go out to an open solicitation where some of our other clients, they can go to a pre-qualified list first. And put together something that you can send out. They can answer questions. They can respond to your requirements matrix, your process flows, and determine. Now you get a sense you begin to determine who can best meet your needs. This is kind of the first step. When we're helping clients with this, we have a vendor database at Astrix that we use. Again, once we understand what the needs of a client are, we query this, and this helps define and develop the pre-qualified vendor list. So that's a service that we certainly offer, but you want to put something together that you can send out to that list or to the vendor community that it can fill out, so you can start to see what the system can do, how they can do it, and how it's going to start to be the appropriate one for you. So the RFP is very, very important. Other things you need to consider and other factors would be developing an evaluation selection plan. How are you going to evaluate the RFPs that come back, and when you get to the demos, how are you going to evaluate the demos? What's going to be your evaluation criteria? And there's a lot. And we help clients determine what this is. Is it going to be based on, let's say, all on functionality? Or will it be a functionality, will cost be in there? Will it be knowledge and experience in your area? How many implementations have they done with clinical laboratories, environmental laboratories, oil and gas laboratories, depending on what you are. We look at market experience. And these are all viable evaluation criteria that, that should be evaluated. Again, we help clients determine this and also understand what the weighting is. It may not, each of those criteria may not be as important as the other. So you want to make sure that you're putting the weighting on the important things for you. Also, developing proposal score sheets, so when these RFPs and the demos, when you get there, and your team is evaluating this, how are they going to score it? How are they going to document that? We always suggest that clients develop a scoring guidance document that outlines all of this that you can actually give to your evaluation team. probably you may have folks on the team that will go through this for the first time. So you want to give them guidance, do's and don'ts, what to look for, et cetera, et cetera. And this all is outlined in these documents. It takes time to put these together, obviously, but what this will allow you to do is you start to do the evaluation. It keeps everybody on the same page, and you always will have a reference to go back to as you start to really look at these systems. Really, once you have that RFP done and you've gone through the evaluation and, maybe you sent it out to 6, 10 vendors, you get those back, you evaluate it, and you say, what, these 3 based on our scoring, or these 3 or 4, seem to kind of rise to a top to be the appropriate ones for us. The next step is a product demonstration, which is very, very important. It's kind of where the rubber meets the road to all of this. The important things with a demonstration is it's not a sales demonstration. It's a demonstration of how that system conforms to your requirements and your workflows. And you have all of this, right? If you've gone through this process and you've evaluated all these factors, you have your workflows, you have your requirements, so you can then develop demonstration scripts based on those that you can provide to the vendor. And really what that guarantees is 2 things. A, that they are going to be showing you the features and the functions that you require according to your requirements and your workflows. And it guarantees that the vendors will be consistent, or as consistent as possible, right? If you've ever seen a demo before, there's a lot going on. I've seen 1,000 of them. And especially a new system that maybe you haven't seen before, you have somebody that is demonstrating the system to you that they know very, very well. That's their job. They know it inside and out. And they're clicking and going from one screen to the other. There's a lot going on. But having a demonstration script is a focus, especially if you provide demonstration data to them, actually your data. So you can see how your data is being entered, how the system can consume your data, how it is able to report your data. Very, very important. Here's an example of an actual demonstration script that we use. Obviously, demos, they're typically a half day to a day, depending. We always suggest to clients, take the day if you can spare it. It's a long day, trust me. But again, you spent a lot of time to this point. You're about to write a big check. Take the extra time to really evaluate a LIMS. Even in a day, you're not going to be able to see every part of the LIMS system, next to impossible. But you look at areas that are important to you. Now, going back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier, where you are different, this is a perfect example to write a script around that quote unquote different area, right? So you can see how the LIMS systems handle that. Now, obviously you're going to see how they log in samples and how they process it and how they generate reports. That'll all be in demonstration scripts, but you can write, certainly a script or 2 around those different areas to, be confident that, the systems can meet those needs. At the end of the day, you've got everything you need to make your decision. You've got the evaluation and scoring of your RFPs and your demos. You can really look at that requirements matrix and see how they conform to the requirements, each of the systems. If there are gaps, sometimes there are, it gives you an opportunity to understand what those gaps are and how do you close that. Maybe it's an extension of the system. Maybe you have to do custom development. Maybe you have to buy another tool, whatever that may be. But you're understanding the gaps here. You're not stumbling upon the gaps during the implementation. And lastly, the cost analysis, which I always say sounds easy to do, but when you get a quote from a vendor, different vendors, they're not necessarily apples and apples. I could probably do a whole webinar on cost analysis. Some vendors, their licensing is concurrent. Others now are subscription based. You'll see some functionality that is built into the main product where other vendors have that functionality in a separate module that they charge for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you can really understand that it will take some time to go through the quotes of the vendors, aligning them so that you're comparing apples to apples. So, in review, so really the question should be is not what the best is, but what is the most appropriate LIMS? there are several factors, that you should evaluate before you start your path of evaluating selection and implementation. Some are, around the product that we've talked about, and others are more around your organization and your readiness to go down that path. But what I always say, it's a long journey. And for those of you that have been through a LIMS implementation before, you probably attest to that. It's not uncommon for, it to be a year. We've done ones that are a lot more. So, it is certainly a marathon. We always seek assistance, if need be. It's not something that if you haven't done it, you want to go at it alone. Everybody needs help in doing big projects, whether you're buying a car, doing a house, or doing a LIMS system. And, we could certainly help you in a lot of these areas. So with that, that's what I have today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
That's great, Rob. Appreciate it. Yeah, there's a couple of questions that popped up on the floor throughout, so we want to go ahead and tackle those. Let me just go ahead and stop the recording.